Hi, I'm Reg Athwal and welcome to our family business channel and Reg Athwal TV. I've got another episode here today of Family Business Advisors, and I've got a fantastic guest here today with us who's going to be sharing her words of wisdom when it comes to the whole area of family business, marriages and divorces and many other subtopics. We've got Emily Brand who's with us today, and I want to do a formal introduction to share with you a little bit more about Emily's background and set the stage for today's conversation. So Emily is one of London's leading family and divorce lawyers. She's recommended in Chambers HNW and Chambers UK and listed as a leading individual in the Legal 500 and top recommended family lawyer 2020 in the Spears 500. This is the elite list we're talking about. Emily qualified as a solicitor in 1996. She was also a partner at Boodle Hatfield LLP, a leading private wealth firm founded, I love this, 1722, coming up to 300 years anniversary, incredible track record as a firm. Emily's expertise lies in advising on the impact of relationship breakdown on privately owned and family businesses. She's worked on a number of groundbreaking cases linked to things like prenuptial contracts, complex financial structures, asset tracing, non-disclosure and enforcement, just to name a few. And hopefully she'll deep dive into some of those cases in the interview. So whether in court proceedings or negotiating private settlements, Emily delivers results for her clients, always focusing on their specific needs and concerns. She's widely respected for a combination of compassion for a client's unique circumstances and astute ability for intelligent problem solving. So on that note, I'd like to welcome Emily onto the screen. Thanks for being with us, Emily. Appreciate your time today. How are you doing?
I'm very well, Reg, and I'm delighted to be speaking to you today. Thanks very much for inviting me.
Really appreciate it, Emily. And I've got so many things I want to ask you today with your wealth of experience. And I know you hit on so many different touch points when it comes to dealing with wealthy families. And I know because of discretion and confidentiality, you will not be disclosing anything today in this interview when it comes to specific clients. That goes against the grain when it comes to our work, but I'm sure on the outer circle you can share some very loose case studies with us, but more importantly share the patterns, the consistent patterns that you've seen with your years of experience when it comes to breakdowns and what happens in divorce situations and prenups and postnups and all these other things that come into it. So maybe to kick things off, maybe could you share just briefly your brief background and how you sort of got involved in this space, just as a brief introduction, Emily?
Well, it's an interesting question because I didn't read law at university. I read English literature. And I think that's quite an interesting background to have, because what I try and do is express people's stories, because what I love my job is that no two families are the same. Although, as Tolstoy might say, you know, unhappy families all have something in common. So I think it's having read theoretically about families, you know, we read a lot about families, relationships, love, sex, children. It's everywhere you go. And I have the joy of working with families on a daily basis. So I started off as an English graduate, and then I luckily went into one of the top London law firms when I qualified, and I went into family, and it aligned. I'd had some of my family had been divorced, and
right.
it was a progression from their experiences and theoretical experiences and enjoying being with people. It's resolving individuals.
Well, great blend of experience, and suppose not the normal route that one enters this space, but that's what makes it special, I think, with your experience. Can I ask you, Emily, when it comes to family businesses or privately owned businesses, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think of it like there's two camps here. There's one which is where maybe a founder or even a husband and wife from startup have built something together. Okay, or maybe one of them started something and the other one played a supporting role and end up building this asset, you know, this family business of significant size with wealth linked to it, or a situation where people have inherited that wealth, generational wealth, and then continued that journey. And with one of those situations, it's then led to conflict and a divorce situation that comes up. So regardless of maybe how it showed up, I'm curious to know, with your experience, what are some of the causes? What are the reasons? What leads to this beautiful relationship going into this evolution of disaster and conflict?
I think that's a hard question because, I mean, coming back to the first point, family businesses, you can have sort of two types of family wealth, as you addressed. You can have a couple who might start off at 24, 25, and together, you know, they become intensely involved in their baby, which might be their business, and they can make different contributions. And I think what often can happen is in that kind of marriage, which I sort of see as a sort of long, young marriage, you know, you set off, you're 25, 26, 27, 28, and you have this amazing excitement. You make this incredibly successful business. But businesses are, you know, they're 24/7 sometimes, and then somebody's going to go off and have a baby, and their roles change.
Yeah.
So the English and exciting, you know, the English law is quite exciting because what it does quite radically, I think from other jurisdictions, it says, oh, well, you have financial contribution and then you have non-financial contribution. So we are a very unusual jurisdiction in some respects, because we don't say, oh, well, you created all the wealth during the marriage, you keep it. What we say is, well, what's the non-financial contribution? Well, caring for children is a contribution. And if you have the kind of marriage where you started off at 25 and you've become multimillionaires, you are looking at a 50% division in the English jurisdiction. That's different, however, say you marry later, or you've got family wealth and then you marry. That wealth has been sort of pre-acquired. That's pre-matrimonial contribution. And you're looking at very different outcomes there. You might be looking at what wealth was accrued during the marriage and what are the parties' needs. Can the financial contributor, as it were, survive without invading non-matrimonial assets? So you might have a situation where you marry later in life, you have 5 children, but all the wealth has come before the marriage. But you still need potentially a lot of money if you're the non-wealth generating spouse. So those are two different things. And actually, you can see how within these two types of scenario, you can have a tension in a marriage. So you can't generalize about what might create it, but wealth can be difficult. That can cause difficulties, different expectations. What do we want for our children? We have, you know, I might have come from a different background to you. Yes. I don't necessarily want my children to go to Eton. Yes. I might want my children to go to the local state school, even though we've got the money to do it. So these are the tensions. And, you know, we don't die as early as we used to. You know, when our parents and grandparents married, sorry, Mum, maybe I should say my grandparents. When our grandparents married, or our great-grandparents, they didn't expect to be married for 60 years because life expectancy was so short. So a 30-year marriage would have been an amazing achievement, but now you see people who've been married for 60 or 70 years. And that's quite a struggle. Marriage is not easy, is it?
So there's obviously a long list there. But with your experiences, what would be typically the top 3, 4, 5 common?
The marriage breakdown.
Yeah. And then leading to calling you up as a phenomenal lawyer and someone saying, look, we want to separate. We want to go through divorce proceedings. And as you start to understand more about what's happened in that family with that couple, you realize, oh yeah, that's number 4 on my list. That's come up 25 times before in the last 20 years.
Well, I think, I genuinely don't think you can say there's a top 10 list. I really don't think there is. I think the biggest problem is people are unhappy. And what makes you unhappy is a very complicated thing. And it can go from, you know, night and day. People don't divorce lightly. They don't go and see a divorce lawyer lightly. And so if they walk through the door and see me, they've had a terrible time most of the time. They've really reached rock bottom. And so I don't think, you know, oh, here's another one. They've got communication problems, or, you know, there's intimacy problems or anything like that. What I generally see is a terribly unhappy person who's suffered a lot and has reached a point where they want to get out or move on from that suffering because it's got so bad. And I want to help them get beyond that, so that they don't have to live in that sort of morass of misery. Because people say, oh, divorce is so easy these days. Marriage is easier. Divorce is difficult. You can go down and get married quite quickly, and
I've never thought of it like that before. Yeah, that's a different perspective.
And also, I mean, it's not marriage that's the problem, it's having children. Everyone can get married very easily. Nobody gets taught how to bring up a child. Most of our cultures just think that that's something that we do naturally. Women can give birth and you can have a child and it's super easy, but that's where the difficulties start. And then, so if I was going to say, well, where do all the difficulties start? Normally, when you've had your first child, because suddenly you're not going out together as a couple. Somebody's got to stay at home. Who's going to look after the child? It's all these difficulties about gender roles. And that leads in a bit to your introduction at the beginning. Why is divorce so prevalent? Well, is it because women have got more to say these days? They've got more opportunities. They earn their own money. They don't need to stick with somebody who makes them unhappy.
Right.
I can leave you because A, the divorce courts will help me. B, I can pay my own way, potentially. And C, there isn't such social stigma. And that's a great thing because, people are very unhappy and they can find themselves into difficulties that they never imagined they'd get into. Most people, if you saw people walk down the aisles, they never imagine that they're going to be divorced.
Yes.
That's not within their imagination.
You mentioned children, first child, suffering, had enough, need to get out. Yeah. So these are sort of key words I've heard so far. And then, so the wealth side, what's your thoughts around that? When you see a couple grow and their businesses have grown and they've become more and more wealthier, and the lifestyle that comes with it, does that have an impact on relationships in any way? The financial, the wealth aspect? I mean, someone who's worth £100 million versus £1 billion versus a small to medium-sized enterprises, a few million pounds. Does the wealth have any link to, one, the cause? Yes, no. And then when there is significant wealth, what are the other considerations, the complexities with a divorce?
Well, yeah, Reg, I'm not a psychologist, okay, but
and I'm not a lawyer.
No, okay, but you can see a connection between people who have a huge drive to succeed, and with the huge drive to succeed, people who make hundreds of millions of pounds, who haven't been given that, they are very interesting, complicated people who want to succeed. And sometimes you could say, well, they don't see other people's point of view. And that's why they can be successful, because they don't see failure as a problem. They might push through that. They might say, okay, well, that didn't quite work. Let's move on. Let's do something else. Okay, I'm going to try something else. And that drive can also lead you to being less responsive potentially in your relationship, less empathetic if that person isn't, the person you marry and you love is not coming with you on that particular journey. A lot of people talk about narcissism in marital breakdown. And of course, if you looked at, somebody with potentially an element of narcissism, the tick boxes, are they very driven? Are they very successful? And do they not see somebody else's point of view? So you could look at it a little bit like that. And some people are just lucky. They don't realize they've hit on something so big. They might start off with a great little idea and then suddenly it goes boom. And they are wealthy beyond their own imaginings.
So based on those scenarios and getting more perspective on the legal side and your expertise rather than the psychological aspects, assuming that things aren't working out and someone approaches you, what are your thoughts on separation phase versus trying to fix things or give it time. And I don't know what percentage of people who are in a separation end up resolving things and back together again and have unity and harmony and carry on that relationship, versus it's inevitable, it's definitely going to head down to the path of being a divorce. So I'm just curious about, when someone approaches you, what are some of the steps? What do you go through as a lawyer, and what's the process?
Well, you can only get divorced if you think your marriage is irretrievably broken down. And we are under an obligation to discuss whether they've considered marriage counselling. And most people, as I say, you know, when they walk through the door to see a divorce lawyer, that's really the final step for them. They don't want to be there necessarily. They will have tried marriage counselling. They will have, you know, accommodated perhaps infidelity. And mostly if there's, you know, one person's been unfaithful and that's been resolved, 10 years later, that might still be a problem. And there might be somebody else. So there are symptomatic issues in a marriage that people think that they can resolve. Generally, they can't. Very rarely, I can count the number of times that people have successfully reconciled.
Is that because of trust, deeper trust issues, or forgiveness has not happened? It's deeper, isn't it?
There are genuine problems with compatibility.
Okay, got it.
You know, that there is something going on there. And I'm not the person to say, but you can, you know, of course, you will have a meeting with somebody who'll describe possibly their spouse's pattern of behavior. And the cynic in me will say, yes, I think there's an affair here. And yes, that's my experience, because you can spot that, because there are patterns with that, unfortunately. Yeah.
I mean, in our firm, Emily, as we've spoken before, I mean, we've worked with, you know, just under 200 family businesses, but most of them are across Africa, Middle East, and Asia. And there's cultural aspects that come into play, which would be maybe different to a wealthy family in UK or Europe or even the United States, where I found.
Well, I mean, I don't think it's that difficult. I mean, as I think one of my clients years ago joked, you know, who wants to write a check or give their house to somebody they don't like anymore? You know, it's a big ask. I don't particularly like you anymore, and you want to take all of my money. You know, I mean, that's quite tough, isn't it? And that's where the pain and the hurt comes in, I think.
I suppose where I'm coming from, Emily, is where I've seen people delay it for as long as possible because of reputation. So the brand equity and the reputation of the family name. If a divorce shows up in the family, it's like in a lot of cultures, like that's really bad. And you do everything you can to avoid that.
Yes, and I think, well, I mean, it's just a cultural evolution. I mean, if you were going to talk about 1950s England and social stigma, divorce was absolutely number one. You know, divorced women wouldn't be invited to social events. I personally see it linking to the evolution of, you know, feminism and women's rights.
Yes.
And, you know, the right to leave your husband because you're unhappy is a fundamental human right. And it's only something very recently. And that's why, you know, even the 70s, 80s, 90s, even within the period I've been practicing, it's linked to, you know, some would say patriarchal control. And you've probably heard about what's going on in England with this new coercive and controlling legislation, which is sending a message. I personally think it's got some big problems, but it's sending a message to say there are certain behaviors we as a society will not accept. But yes, it is.
Could you expand on that, Emily, for people who are listening to this who are not aware of that, just to educate them?
So we now have a criminal offence that
we've lost Emily with her connection there. Bear with us, and hopefully we'll have her back shortly. So welcome back. We lost Emily there for a short period of time, but that's okay. We've got her back on our mobile with a connection. So Emily, welcome back. And I think just before we got cut off, we were having a conversation around some new legislation. You were going to share briefly what that is.
So what's been introduced recently is a piece of criminal legislation which you can be prosecuted if you're there's a pattern of behavior which shows that you've been controlling or coercive towards your spouse. And it's a form of domestic abuse to protect against domestic abuse. But it's a very complicated piece of legislation in some respects, because even minor things could be considered to be controlling.
Right.
Such as having CCTV in your home, or something that your partner doesn't consent to.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's complicated, and unfortunately increasingly being used in divorces to to up the ante, particularly when children are involved. It can be quite unpleasant.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's good to know. So could you give some thoughts on, please, on when it comes to, I think there's a phrase about living together agreements that lawyers, create and develop. Is that right? Living together agreements. What does that mean? What are different type of living together agreements?
so unlike some jurisdictions, we don't have any legal rights between two people who are living together. So you don't acquire status as a common law spouse if you happen to be living with someone. So you don't get any special rights other than, so, if you happen to be living with someone, you have the same rights as somebody you meet in the street basically would have, unless you can show some property rights or acquire rights under other pieces of legislation. So what people do sometimes do is write cohabitation agreements to say things like, oh, well, if I contribute this to the payment of the mortgage or to the property, I will have an interest in the property in which I'm living. Mm-hmm. So you don't have automatic rights if you're not married in England, and you have to be careful about that, because there is this myth of the common law marriage, and it's just a myth. But we do have other legislation. So if you have a child outside marriage, you can have some financial support, even to the extent of capital support under Schedule 1 of the Children Act. So you're not completely out in the cold if you have a child but you're unmarried. But it's really the birth of a child that makes all of the difference in those circumstances.
What happens if you've got two people living together for 15, 20 years, not legally married?
Nothing.
Nothing.
You can say you move into your boyfriend's house, you live with him as though he's your husband for 25 years. He decides he doesn't want anything more to do with you. He can change the locks, and property law is supreme, and you are not entitled to go back into the house.
Wow. Yeah, because I'm coming across these cases around the world. People go, oh, what, marriage, who needs this marriage certificate? We're in love, we can just be together, we don't need a piece of paper. But when I hear what you've just said, I think that piece of paper is going to come in quite handy.
Well, I mean, it's very handy so this is interesting, sort of going back to what you were talking about before, Reg. There are lots of different types of marriage. If you're in a long marriage and you have 4 children, you, as a non-financially contributing person, are going to have rights to a home, if there's money available, financial support, possibly until you die. If you're not married, if you don't have the ring in your finger, you will have a similar entitlement, potentially, but only until your youngest child has left home. And then you're out. So it doesn't matter what lifestyle you've lived with somebody, if you have no money of your own and you're not married, you could find yourself in the street. And that sounds a bit melodramatic, but that is what the law says. If you've made no financial contribution and you don't have any property rights.
Amazing.
It is amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing and shocking, actually. Yeah. What's your thoughts and guidance, if anyone's listening to this today? Just a few tips maybe and thoughts, and I'm sure in the bio section, if people want to know more about your firm, they'll find the website, and we'll make sure your details are there and they can connect with you personally. But just as a quick overview, prenups and postnups, could you give us some thoughts around what's involved, the benefits, pros and cons around these things, and definitely the distinction between a prenup and then creating a postnup?
So prenuptial agreements are not valid contracts, unlike civil law jurisdictions. So we cannot oust the jurisdiction of the court when it's deciding financial settlements on divorce. But if you are getting married and you might have a lot of your own personal wealth, or you're marrying somebody with wealth, you can create an agreement deciding what will happen, or what you would like to happen on your divorce. And provided certain safeguards are met, you've had legal advice, there's been a cooling off period, you've had a proper discussion, the likelihood is, if it's fair when you go into the agreement, fair when you come out of the agreement, and as we all know, fairness is in the eye of the beholder, it's highly likely, hopefully, if you're lucky, that a court will uphold that agreement. But increasingly, prenuptial agreements are being challenged. So if you are going to enter into one, have a lot of discussion about it. And it's a useful discussion to have. You know, what kind of marriage are we going to have? What's going to happen if I have children? Am I going to stop working? Are you going to support me? What happens then? Because I mean, you know, on the one hand, feminism and, you know, equality has liberated women in many respects. It also says, well, actually, if you're going to have a career, you have to keep working. And so you can have quite a difficult discussion. Who's going to look after the kids? How are we going to look after our kids? Do you expect me to give up my career? What's going to happen? And that's what you can talk about in a prenuptial agreement. So that's good. Postnuptial agreements are, sometimes people want to have a postnuptial agreement which reflects the prenuptial agreement immediately after the marriage, just to strengthen it. Although
could you have a postnup agreement if you don't have, and you haven't had a prenup?
You can. So that's the second type.
Okay.
And a lot of people say, well, our marriage isn't really working very well. Let's talk about what might happen if we were to get divorced. And those are particularly difficult postnuptial agreements to negotiate, because in the back of your mind is the divorce court calling me, and what will I get in the divorce court if we don't work it out? But equally, say for example, your parents want to gift you a large amount of money, but they feel uncomfortable about essentially gifting it to you and your husband.
Yes.
That's when you could do a postnuptial agreement and say, look, we're all clear, you know, when mum gives me whatever, that's separate. That's not going to be divided up, were we, God forbid, to get divorced.
His or hers.
Yeah, and that's a much simpler agreement. Everybody understands what it's about. It seems much fairer, much clearer once you're married. Or if there's a liquidity event, you know, your father's sold his business, he wants to distribute money amongst the children, perfect opportunity for a postnuptial agreement within the family.
Yeah, that's clear. With this episode that we're recording today, Emily, and going live here in May 2021, if someone's maybe watching this in 2030, who knows, on one of the channels, looking back at what was happening in 2021 during COVID. This week, I was shocked with the news of Bill and Melinda Gates. You know, 27 years of marriage. Bill's in his mid-60s. Melinda's in a mid-50s. And then this announcement on Twitter mentioning that they'll be divorcing, and the statement very clearly saying that they no longer feel they can grow together. Now, we don't know the truth. We're not in that family, but you've dealt with many of those cases with wealthy families. Could you give us some thoughts? I know it's hypothetical, but what things could be going on internally to get to a stage, especially when you're a wealthy family and you're talking in the top 10, you know, richest families in the world. What happens behind the scenes to get to that point? And then once it's out in the open and publicly declared and announced, what happens after? What are some of the things that could be happening? We'd love to get your thoughts and opinions.
Well, I mean, they've had a very long marriage, and they might be thinking, perhaps we don't want to be together until we die, because, you know, you go into your 50s and your 60s and you're perhaps thinking, well, we've brought the children up, we've done our bit, but we're not quite as compatible as we were. And maybe they've got other partners which they're being very discreet about, and they perhaps would like to spend more time with that partner. You don't know what's going on, but what it does show is there isn't such a pressure, even for people who are leaders, which they both are. You know, they're great philanthropists, they have great contributions. They don't feel that pressure anymore to stay together just for the sake of what everybody's thinking. They want to be free. And maybe that's what's going to be happening more. I'm not sure whether marriage as an institution is going to be quite so valid in another 50, 100 years, I'm afraid.
That's a strong statement.
Well, I mean, if you think about where marriage comes from, it's to do with women being property, and you want to be sure who your children are, because we now know who our children are. We can just have a test. So it's not about control anymore. It's about freedom to be who you are, and whether you can find that happiness perhaps in your
it's like a horse stud farm to me.
well, some people, you know, the genetic imperative, you know, the biologists would say you want to choose one particular person to have children with, but maybe you want to have someone else to care for you when you're old. It might not be the same person, and maybe we should be open to that.
But if you feel it's going to evolve, or maybe not even be here in 100, 200 years, what's the alternative? Where do you see it going? What will be the alternative types of agreements that will happen?
Well, I mean,
relationship.
I feel very strongly about paternity leave. I think we need to send very strong messages out to men that it's okay to look after your children. And women are very much put at a disadvantage by maternity leave. You know, you can now take a year out. That puts you in difficulties potentially with your work, your clients, your business. If men had the same pressure, then they would have, I think, potentially a different attitude to childbearing. So maybe if we're going to be very radical, Reg, this is my radical message.
Go for it,
perhaps we should have agreements when you have children. So it's easy to, you know, walk up the aisle, and it's quite easy to have a baby, but maybe we should talk quite seriously about what that involves and what that means for you when you're pregnant with your partner, and what your expectations are from fathers and mothers in the 21st century. Yeah,
that's good. I like that. With the time that we've got left, I know you're a busy woman, and I'm glad to catch you today for an hour. Could you give us any insights onto trusts, like what's happening in the modern world when it comes to trusts and protection? So assuming that one is going through a divorce proceeding and that's happening, what happens now to the estate assets, and how trusts come into this?
Trusts are becoming less popular from a tax perspective. I'm not a trust expert, but what the courts look at is what properties are actually available to the two parties, to the spouses. Yeah. Some trusts might have been set up generations ago. So the question is it a resource available to the parties? If, however, you've settled a trust during your marriage, it might be considered to be a nuptial settlement that can be set aside anyway. So if you are thinking about divorce, you need to have some early advice to make sure that assets that you think are invulnerable, such as your business, actually are invulnerable, you know, that no one can attack them. Because part of my job is to look at all of the assets and say, well, what can I get for my client? Where is the capital in this marriage? Where did that money come from during the marriage? And if it's from the business or from the trust, it might still be available, even though you might think it's locked away. It might not be. The divorce courts in England have a very wide jurisdiction, wide powers, if they want to exercise them.
What happens though? I know you've got other experts in your firm who deal with this, and maybe you'll have an opportunity to interview a few of them in the future. Is it worthwhile setting up trusts during marriage? So if there is a divorce, at least you're protecting the family assets. You know, this comes up a lot with clients. They ask the question, okay, if someone's entitled to half of what? And especially if that person is part of a multi-generational family business, and there's operating companies and there's other assets, is it better to put all of that into a trust? And then whatever the share is of that individual, the 50-50, their share, there'll be some exit plan, or an asset has to be sold, or a payout has to happen, but without sabotaging the family legacy and protecting all the assets. I don't know, just some thoughts. I don't know if you've had experience with it.
I mean, it's a very complicated issue that you've raised. Excellent question, because of course it's absolutely the heart of everything. what we're looking at now is different types of assets, matrimonial assets. And one of the key matrimonial assets is the matrimonial home. Whatever the financial contribution has been read, you're looking probably at a 50% division of that, probably in the English courts. All the other assets we would need to look at very carefully. Are they assets that are non-matrimonial? Were they there before they got married? Are the separate assets that are family assets? Yeah. So what you want to be very careful about is don't intermingle family and marital assets. You don't necessarily need to set up a trust, it's a good idea, but spouses and not family relatives should not necessarily be included in those trusts. But equally, you've got to struggle with, are they benefiting from them indirectly through their lifestyle? So you need to look very carefully about who owns these properties, who owns the assets, how are the assets being held, are there third-party interests that are competing? And if you were looking at that, what I would say is, well, the third-party interests are very relevant, but it's exactly what we do as lawyers is looking at the structure and see if you can slightly divorce-proof it. So the more third parties that are not spouses involved in the business, it's a good thing.
Yeah, I get it. That's a really good answer. That gives a lot of clarity on the complexity and how to get alignment in those areas. It's almost like different buckets, and you've got to make sure you've got the right things in the right bucket, because once you start,
but that's why prenuptial agreements are very good, because they can clarify those buckets,
right, and
explain those buckets and say, if this happens, that bucket is not going to be invaded. And that's why, as lawyers, we need to think, well, what is the spouse's needs going to be? What's the standard of living going to be? How do we protect those bits that need to be passed on to the next generation? You know, my grandfather worked incredibly hard to create that. I don't necessarily want that to be handed on to somebody who's not a blood relative.
Exactly. When someone's doing a prenup or postnup or any of these agreements, Emily, I know it's complex and not one size doesn't fit all, but typically if someone approaches you, is this a process that is over a couple of hours? Is it 3-4 different meetings over a couple of weeks? Does it take a couple of months? You know, what typically, with your vast experience doing prenups or postnups, these type of agreements, how long does it take to walk in and you're done?
Depends how complex your assets are. So they can take a long time. And also it depends, let's talk about the leading case, Radmacher and Granatino. They signed their prenuptial agreement about 4 months before they got married. And they had a 3-hour conversation and they didn't give proper disclosure about their assets. But Mrs. Granat, Frau Radmacher walked away with giving her husband nothing, effectively, in his capacity as her spouse. So complexity, discussions, negotiations. Who's running the negotiations? Is it really dad? Is it really mum? Who's really driving the prenup? What do they want? How well can the bride and groom communicate with each other? Because often I will say to clients, you don't have to give that. My advice is don't do that. We can protect that a bit more. And they'll say to me, no, I don't want to, Emily. I'm marrying this person, I love them, and I want to go into this marriage knowing that we're equal parties. And you think, that's lovely. And of course, I'm now going to shut up, but I have to, I want to give you that advice. So they will talk. And it's a very good sign, that they have open communications, they know what they're talking about. So there's no rule of thumb. Right. Sometimes people want one in 14 days, or I'm getting married next month. Can you do it right now?
What's the fastest you've ever done it in? What's your
I've been negotiating sometime, with somebody standing outside, with the opposite party standing outside, a few days. Maybe 2 days before the wedding, but don't ever do that. It's not a good idea for your prenup. Lots of preparation, lots of discussion, lots of thought. This is your bespoke document. It's like fitting at your wedding dress. What makes you look, what do you feel comfortable in?
If you've got a multi-generational family, 3-4 generations, reputation, the whole legacy is important, and you've got a next-gen member dating someone, and when's the right time to bring up the prenup in that relationship?
I think as soon as possible.
Well, on the first date. Oh, by the way, I've just brought a document with me. If we could just go through this.
I think, right, when it's getting serious, I think you're going to have to say, I mean, a lot of people don't know how wealthy the person they're dating might be. Because I think a lot, you know, you want to be discreet. You don't want to go around saying, actually, you've had your lucky day. I didn't tell you, actually, I'm worth X, Y, Z, you know, tens of millions or whatever. But if it's getting serious and you think this person's the one, you know, you do need to say very sad. I just want to say, you know, we will have to have a prenup because everybody in my family has them. And I think that's the easiest way to put it. It's not you, darling. Everybody has them. And actually, most families should be thinking very carefully about prenups, because divorce is a really good way, if you get it wrong, to destroy your family assets.
Yeah, got it. So I've got a couple of other questions just to before we wrap up, but I appreciate your time, and then like to talk a little bit about your firm as well, because I think it's an incredible story, and exactly what you're doing in the firm that you're in is my dream with our firm 300 years in the future. To have a firm that lasts for that long, I think is incredible. I love the story, and when I was reading up about the history of your firm. So before we do that, a couple of questions. Children, I know you have a lot of experience dealing with children as well, and their matters. When there is a divorce, any tips or thoughts, you know, and someone who's, you know, thinking about going through this, what impact does it have on the children? What things should they be aware of when it comes to children?
Children are very sensitive to mood. And if you talk to anybody who's a child expert, you know, that they're social workers or they're child psychologists or whatever, you would be surprised even the youngest children are picking up arguments and conflict. And everybody will say in the business, avoid conflict if you can in front of the children. But equally, I wouldn't say shut them out. You need to talk to your children. You know, Daddy and I aren't getting on very well at the moment. You know, we're sorry. You know, we love you, but we're not getting on. And I think it's just a very simple, you know, child-focused explanation, and not bad atmospheres. You know, it's difficult for children being in a bad atmosphere. If your marriage isn't working, it's not working. It's not your child's fault. And, you know, it's not your fault either. These things happen. Yeah. And it's non-judgmental. You know, it is non-judgmental, and to have the children just protected by not having the arguments blazing rows in front of them if you possibly can, not saying nasty things about your ex if you possibly can. And we're all human. You know, if somebody said, oh, well, of course, I've never said anything bad about anyone. We are human. You have to forgive yourself as well. But if you can, you know, keep conflict out of the arena when the children are there.
And Emily, I know you're known with your brand where you have this level of compassion. And I've met many lawyers who would not have this type of conversation and some of the things that you've said today, where it's very black and white, very direct. But I feel that you bring your heart into your job, Emily. Is that fair? I mean, that's quite unique about your brand.
Well, I think divorce is a really horrendous thing to go through. You don't wish it on your worst enemy. You really don't. But on the other hand, one of the joys I have in my job is seeing my clients afterwards, and it's a transformation. And it's wonderful to see people, because you know, people are happy again. And I also really love meeting people who are about to get married, and it's exciting and joyful. And there's always that, you know, it's the future, and we want our clients and their families and their children to have positive outcomes and good futures. So they feel that wasn't a great period of my life, but now things are getting better, and I've got things to look forward to.
Love it.
A bit like the pandemic. We're going to get through it. We've got things to look forward to.
We talked about that. You'll be back in your offices by September. So yeah.
Or maybe not. Yeah.
Last question, and this is to do with a couple of cases that I'm going through right now with clients. And also, to a certain extent, I'm also going through. You know, I would love to get your opinion, which is, I've been married for 27 years. I'm living in Dubai right now. My wife and children are in the UK. and we have 2 homes. And there's this, you know, the more I read up on, we thought it was very strange to begin with, going back and forth. And it's the second time that we've tried this, where once it was to do with the kids' aspirations, where 2 of them wanted to become football players and had to go back to the UK, and my wife was supporting them. And then they sort of grew up, and then for other reasons, I mean, I love the warm weather. I can't stand the cold.
It's very cold at the moment.
My wife also has other aspirations, you know, with her career and future plans. I'm stuck on what I'm doing in this part of the world. Plus, we absolutely annoy each other if we're living in the same household for a long period of time. So, you know, it absolutely works, but it's very strange for most people when they think, wow, how can you have a marriage where you know, the relationship is not in the same household, in the same country, 24 hours a day. And I believe that there's a trend, isn't there, about living apart together. I believe it's called LAT, which is becoming a trend around the world. But also there are other hybrids of that, or some people call it the unconventional marriage. You know, what are your thoughts, Emily, with your experience? Are you seeing any of these things, or is it me and 2 other families I'm dealing with right now? We're just the strangers and weird ones who are doing this right now.
I don't think there's anything weird. I mean, I think the problem with social media and the world we live in, everybody thinks, oh, well, I must tick this particular box.
Yeah.
It's irrelevant. It's what works for you. What works for you? That's all that matters. And separate, apart, Saturday, Sunday, you know, you spend Christmas in different countries, you know, Diwali somewhere else, you know, it doesn't really matter. Maybe, you know, as long as you communicate and you're happy. I think we have to throw out other people's expectations as to what works for us. And the great thing as you get older is you care less about what people think. Why do you care? Do what you like.
Yeah, you've got to be happy. And like you said, I think the key word you said earlier was about freedom. And yeah, it's about happiness ultimately, isn't it? If you're not happy.
Yeah. And, you know, being, you know, together night and day, people got different interests, different careers, it might be claustrophobic. For some people, they can't think of it, you know, a night going by without, you know, being with their partner. For others, if you're in a very strong marriage, you don't need to be, you know, cheek by jowl with them all the time. If you trust someone, you don't need to be cheek by jowl with them. So again, it's what works for you. No wrongs.
And the only other reason I'm bringing that up again with a couple of cases that I've got right now is where people have intentionally made a decision where they're living apart but still together, but also keeping that marriage for other benefits as well, rather than, you know, absolutely going through a divorce proceeding and the complications of that as well on wealth and kids. So there's also other reasons why people do it. Is that a fair statement, Emily?
I think that's a very fair statement, and that's a very grown-up attitude. And with all due respect to the French presidents, I think a lot of them have done that. And it's, you know, it's depending on your religious, you know, commitments or your faith, it can be that, you know, divorce doesn't exist for you, and you can find other ways to arrange your marriage successfully so that everybody gets what they might want out of it. And that's also an option. So, I mean, you can draft separation agreements. And if somebody came to me and said, look, I don't want to divorce, I want to live separately, what I would say to them is, well, what are your financial circumstances? So if 20 years down the line you do get divorced for whatever reason it is, have you got financial security today, and will that continue during your period of separation? So you might want to rearrange your assets so there are more assets in one party's name so that that person feels secure, and then maybe there will be no need for anything else to be done. So again, it's just making sure everybody feels secure, they're trusted, they have what they need from the marriage. And whether the ring's on the finger or it's not on the finger, or you have that freedom, again, 21st century, we can do what we like.
Emily, I think it comes down to, if I go a bit spiritual for a second, but if we put pieces of paper to one side, rings to one side, where we live, the wealth that we have, you know, we come into this world and then we leave, and it's a very short period of time. You know, in a universal time and space, it's a nanosecond. But we call it 75 years or 80 years or 90 years or 100 years. And for me, it's all about energy and vibration. And if happiness is there at the core, that's, for me, you know, my opinion, that's what it's about. The rest, you know, our society and what we see around us and what's going on is just part of our world. And we have to deal with these things. But if we go to the core.
Yeah, but it's very challenging. It's a very challenging thing to say, well, what makes me happy?
Yes.
It's a very challenging question. And, you know, coming back to, you know, Bill and Melinda, maybe they've worked it out. And that's why they've reached the conclusion they've reached. And it's not something you know when you're 18, 19, 20, 30. Maybe it's something people acquire. Understanding.
Well, it's like someone said to me the other day, they may be going through a divorce, and it's but you know, $100 billion will go a long way to supporting your lifestyle and everything else. But you know, what's interesting is not about the money, is it? You can still be unhappy, and yet you're building a foundation and changing the world. You know, you've got shares in all these companies, including building a phenomenal company called Microsoft. But then still there's something fundamental at a basic level, which has created unhappiness for two people to go, you know, let's call it a day. Yeah. And that's just the amazing thing, which is with all the other things going on, still it comes down to some basic things and not about, it's not even about the money. It's not even about purpose, because they both got purpose by building a foundation together. I mean, it's such an unbelievable case study.
But we're human, aren't we? It doesn't matter whether you're the richest person in the world. We're just human, aren't we? I mean, so it's, we all want to be happy. We all want to find meaning, and we all want to be loved, and we all want to love. And that's a very complicated cocktail, isn't it?
It is. Well, on that note, Emily, I think that is a perfect time to end our interview for today. I really appreciate your time. And just briefly, when it comes to your firm, and if anyone watching right now, Emily is an expert in the areas that we've discussed today, but in the firm, just going through the research that I was doing, whether it comes to artists and collectors or private wealth, charities, landed estates, trustees, dealing with entrepreneurs, galleries, auction houses, museums. The list is endless. Please go to the website. Everything's in the bio, where there's a lot of other partners in the firm with Emily who touch on all these other areas and a lot more. But anything else you'd like to close off, Emily, when it comes to your firm and almost celebrating 300 years?
Well, next year is our 300th anniversary, so we will be having lots of celebrations. And yes, it's a wonderful firm, because we actually cater for people's various interests of, you know, whether it's your car, your art, and we want to help people enjoy their lives.
Well, I hope people reach out to your firm if they're watching this and got value. Also, you know, you can do a search on Emily Brand and connect with her personally through media and through her office. And Emily, I really appreciate your time, and hope we can do this again in the near future and talk about some other topics that we haven't had a chance to explore today.
Reg, it's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Bye for now.